Blessings and welcome back, everyone. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth, and I'm joined today for a second time by the mage and celestial priest, Christopher Warnock. Thank you so much again for being here, Christopher.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you joining us. So just before we begin on our topic of the day, I just want to make sure that I get people at the outset. I have a little project book club, Firmicus Maternus Mathesis, Benjamin Dyke's translation. It is the last Monday of every month. So if people are interested in hopping on for the Firmicus Maternus reading, you can find it on Patreon. Thank you to patrons. Okay, thanks for sitting through that, Christopher. Shall we begin? I'll do a little intro and then you can go ahead and take it away. So today we're kind of outlining our talk, talking about occult virtue as an alternative to this like omnipresent energy explanation when it comes to astrology and magic, like how they work. And so just outlining what I understand about Christopher, your kind of outline is that we approach it in three levels, which is worldview. It's kind of more of an overarching fundamental consciousness and unconsciousness, like our view of reality, everything that we sort of choose and the kind of subconscious flow. And then two, we work with methodology, this interconnected set of methods and principles and rules, obviously denoted by that worldview. And then we have the heuristic, like our guides and our rules of thumb. So that'll be the outline for talking today about occult virtue. So thank you very much for lining this up for us, Christopher.
Yeah, it's great to be here. So let's see, it's funny because somebody tried to post on my YouTube channel. They said they should something to the effect of like, should do a drinking game about atheistic materialism and they'll have a drink every time you say that. And of course I deleted and they don't get the comment didn't go in there, but I do talk about it a lot. And I think that, it's just one of those things. It's like if you don't get worldview and if you don't understand what your own worldview is, then you're gonna be lost. Basically, that's the foundation. And something that occurred to me recently is that it's really easy to do a labeling. I mean, this is one of the modern sort of like a scientific or academic approach. What you do is you look at things and then you label them. So what you do is you take everything and put it in a box, and
Mm-hmm.
that box defines it, and that's what it is. And so it's limited to the label too. The label is a very much of a limiting sort of thing. So if you're X, you're not Y. And if you're Y, you're not X. And so it's a very much of a way of freezing things and controlling things and then limiting things. And it also basically kind of it's very it limits it to that particular label. So it chops everything up. So really when I think about worldview in particular, but methodology and heuristics work this way to a certain extent as well. What I think about is like gravitation. So if you think about each worldview as like, like the modern worldview as like a black hole, right? It's exerting this incredibly powerful gravitational force, but everybody's in a kind of different orbit around it. And you can be very close to it and have a strong influence, or you can be further away. But nobody in the modern world can escape the gravitational pull of the modern worldview. I mean, even if you look at yourself and say, "Oh no, I don't have a modern worldview," it's like then you're not aware of the influence it's having on you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, and yet other ones, there's other things that have gravitational too. Like if you think about the planets, I mean, obviously the sun, everything's orbiting the sun. So that's the main gravitational pull. But the planets have gravitation on each other. So for example, they discovered, Neptune and Uranus because the other planets had these perturbations, gravitational, that they said, oh, we can tell there's a planet out there. So that's true of everything else. So everybody's in their own orbit. So to say to somebody, oh, you're atheistic materialist or you have the modern worldview, that's a label. And that's not really getting the underlying nuance of it. Really what we're talking about is, like I said, is gravitational pull and the subtle influence on people. And so everybody's different. And then there can be movement within that. So that's what I would say as we start thinking about this is not like, oh, this is a label and I'm American, and then you get all the
Mm-hmm.
baggage that goes with that. It's more like I said, this is an influence on you, but not a weak one either. Think of gravity's pretty powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so
Um,
like understand the water that you're swimming in, give it its due, and understand that that is going to have more of a gravitational pull on you and the way that you sort of manifest in the world, or the way that you sort of manifest your magic or your astrology, because that worldview sort of seeping in and pervading the rest of your life and the influence about how you think
well,
about things and
yeah, it controls it,
yeah.
basically. It's the underlying basis for it. Okay, so then the methodology is like not as comprehensive. A methodology is a sort of set of working methods. If you think of like a carpenter, like all the different, things you know how to do as a carpenter. And they're not disconnected either. They all kind of fit together. And so, and an example of that would be modern psychological natal astrology. I mean, that's a particular methodology. And that's in fact the base that most people use for all. In fact, that's a lot of people, that's what they think. When you say astrology, they're like, what are you? I'm an astrologer. What kind of astrology do you do? Astrology.
Mhm.
That's all they know about what they're talking about in modern psychological natal style. And then a
Mhm.
heuristic is, like you said, a rule of thumb. So, I mean, for example, we do this all day long. I mean, you cannot get through the day without using heuristics. And so, for example, you go to the store, you're supposed to buy some wine. I'm going to buy some wine, so I get the most expensive. That's the best. And that's not wrong. It's just a sort of a rough guide to it. So, an example of that in astrology would be like rules like. So the reason that Pluto rules Scorpio is because Pluto is like Scorpio, right? I mean, that's the standard modern approach, is that when you look at things, you're going to like equals like, particularly like for rulerships. What's interesting about it, if you look at medieval Renaissance triplicity rulerships, for example, Saturn, who's cold and dry, rules is a day triplicity ruler of air, which is hot and wet. So people say, well, that's not like that, which it's confusing to them because like rules like. That's the methodology that they automatically use. Well, the reason they do that is because Saturn is a malefic. And if you put him in who's cold and dry and hot and wet, it balances him. It makes him more temperate, makes him less malefic. Same thing with Mars. Hot and dry. It's a nitroclicity ruler of water, which is cold and wet. It also balances him. So
Mhm.
you can see that. So that's what's important to understand, that there, for example, with that, there's other possible heuristics, right? And that actually you're using heuristics as opposed to, oh, it has to be that way. It's like, wait a second, there's some underlying principles here. There's some underlying things. Heuristic is also like a meme. I think that's the most basic meme level,
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
like, and if people are familiar with that, it's like the idea, this, it's talking about like an idea, like it's infectious. It's
Mhm.
like you can catch it like a virus, and that's a way of, as opposed to I have these ideas and they're my ideas, the idea has you. So that's
Right.
another way
And
of
it's
thinking
just like a
about that or
little
the concept.
And a meme would be like a little flash that like, obviously it probably goes viral and all of this stuff, but it implicates like a whole lot more, but everyone's going to get it because they're sort of all going by that rule of thumb of that little
Well, if you
thing.
think of like if worldview is a language, right? And so in methodology, well, maybe this is even like it's sort of like methodology. Well, it's like a heuristic is like a word or a letter,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
that makes sense.
So that's sort of like so as I said again, so worldview is should I'll start with that. Worldview is your conscious philosophy, but also your unconscious views of how things work. And so really it is your reality. And every everyone has a worldview, but it's actually more, I think, appropriate to say the worldview has you.
Yeah.
So rather than the individuals have chosen this, it's like you get it. People don't come up with their own worldviews. What they get it from their society, from if they're in a subculture, maybe from their family, maybe social stuff. But for the most part, it's from society. And
Hmm.
really, what we are is manifestations of worldview. And rather than saying again that we have a worldview, the worldview has us. Each of us is walking around individual instantiation of a particular worldview. So the
Let me,
modern, go ahead.
oh, no, I was just going to ask you, and if this derails, we can cut it out and we don't have to use it. Um, I'm wondering if we go to that second level, which is the methodology. Let's say we don't have as much conscious choice around our worldview. We can say, okay, we were born Christian, but now we choose to be Buddhist or something like that. But then our default setting goes back to that, like, whatever United States Christian, whatever mindset, or this is just a very dull example, okay? And then you choose a different framework. Do you think that by sort of practicing a certain methodology that goes along with the worldview that you'd like to create, that one can influence the other. So like, can level two ever influence level one?
Yeah, I mean, that was my basic. First of all, if someone says I'm a Buddhist, but their underlying view of reality is that there's nothing but matter and energy,
Right.
right? Their worldview
Mhm.
is the same as someone who's a scientist and says there's nothing but matter and reality. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And
Yeah.
most everybody, no matter what your ostensible belief, I mean, like I said, I believe in God, but how do things work? Well, it's matter and energy, it's beams. You know,
Right.
but again,
Mhm.
it comes back to being an atheistic materialism. Like I said, that's just this really, really the bedrock nature of reality is like what it, how do you understand reality to work? And what I learned as a kid was don't ask people about their religious beliefs because they can't explain them and they get upset if you ask questions about them. And that's because they don't make any sense. And most of the time, that's because they are atheistic materialistic at their core, unconsciously, and they're layering some kind of religious belief over the top of it, which doesn't isn't logical,
Yeah, they're
right?
not like congruent to one another, and
Yeah, it's
people
not an
just sort of
inherent,
like
it's not,
rectify these big gaps or
yeah.
whatever.
And so, but it's sort of like, and I get this all the time because people are like, well, I have a right to my opinion. And I'm like, okay, whatever. I mean, you can't explain it. It doesn't make any sense. It's irrational. And if I ask you about it, you get upset. But yeah, sure. It's just like, you can like, you know, um, whatever, rotten meat on pizza. I mean, that's just like, if that's what you like, that's what you like. You know what I mean? But when you're talking about explaining, because it was always important to me to be internally consistent. I didn't like having this, why am I doing this? How does it work?
Mhm.
And that was kind of, so what I would say about it is that the methodology, for example, of horror astrology, if I, after I did it about 1,000 times, it works 1,000 times. And if you
Mhm.
think about it, well, what's the consequences of that? What does it mean that if horror astrology works? It's like, well, we can get into that a little later, but it's like that did break open the worldview stuff for me. So yes, I think that's 100% correct. What is necessary though is a very deep and searching look at what you're doing because all of this is part of reality. And if you look at anything in a really, really deep level, you can see the nature of reality through it. And I mean, a good example of that is in my other career, I'm a lawyer, and I've just finished writing the first draft of a book on the law of evictions in my state, which seems very dry. But it's like by doing this book and going really deeply into it, you can see a lot of really deep stuff. But see, this is the thing is like people don't go deeply into things. They don't see what they're doing. Like I said, most of my customers, like with, you know, if it works, that's all they care about. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I mean, they're not going to be concerned about the underlying principles of it. It's not something they're interested in. It's like, which is fine. People are busy. They're probably not sad and ruled. I mean, I am. So it's like that stuff interests me. So it's nothing wrong with that. But it's like, if you're the kind of person that wants to penetrate deeply into anything, there you can pretty much do with almost anything. But yeah, there's certain things. For example, I mean, astrology is applied spiritual, um, you know,
Principles.
principles. Yeah, exactly. Magic is too. And so if you want to understand the spiritual and you work with the spiritual, obviously that's going to be a useful way of doing it. I mean, you could do it from being I mean, as an attorney, I can see the spiritual
Mhm.
underlying underpinnings of the law, right? And
Mhm.
so that's there as well. Um, and so yeah, I would say that's correct. You can move. It's kind of hard to go from the heuristics to that, but it's also possible. It's sort of like basically it's having that deep attention to what you're actually doing and what's actually happening. And if you
Mhm.
can if you can understand exactly what's happening in front of you, then you understand because it's all right here. I mean, there's nothing else other than this, right? This is it. There's nothing else, no place to go, nothing to do. Eternity is not in the past or in the future. It's right now. And so if you really understand where you are at this moment and understand what you are, then you're going to be enlightened. So you can
Yeah,
get
and
a
at that
lesser
point, I was
enlightenment,
just going to say,
get
at
a
that point,
lesser
now you're
enlightenment. Yeah,
enlightened.
yeah.
But enlightenment consciousness is not totally something that people are just going to stumble on, although it could happen. I
Sometimes they
think.
do.
Yeah, it could. It
It
could.
happens. Same thing with
Yeah.
mountains. I mean, the mountain spontaneously becomes enlightened. I mean, because the mountain is just as enlightened or just as capable of enlightenment as a human. So it's like, and the twig and everything, the cat and the pencil and all that sort of stuff. So,
And
and
some of
it's
the teachers and the yogis also say that that's kind of like one of the more like authentic types of stumbling onto enlightened consciousness is just this happening. But let's say we have, okay, so when we think of the populace, we have the moon, and it's just like all the people. All the people are probably just interested in like what works. They're busy and they got to get to work and they just want the thing to work. They want the love or the money or the whatever. And then you have the select few that might be interested in like going deeper, and they know they're a fish in water and that their worldview is sort of subtly, pressing in on them if they want to change their worldview or something like this. And this is why I asked about, I don't know about the third level of the second, but if we add this second and you have like certain practices and methodology that you're doing that sort of support the worldview that you'd like to inhabit, you would think that slowly those practices could influence that worldview and sort
It
of
just
build that
depends.
bridge.
It just depends. Like, for example, I don't know if you're at all familiar with 12 step, like AA, if you know anything about
Yeah.
that. Okay, so
Absolutely.
there are people that, because if you go to AA, they have the 12 steps.
Mhm.
And when people, are really hit rock bottom and they show up, as an alcoholic or drug addict or whatever at 12 step and they hear the stuff, particularly from people that are recovered alcoholics or drug addicts themselves, it can have a tremendous impact on you. It really kind of, because it's new and it's this wisdom that you've never encountered before, and it can really have a great impact on you. The problem that happens is there's people that have been showing up for AA for 20 years and they hear the same stuff after a while and then they become impervious to it.
Yeah.
So this is the problem, is that yes, you can be doing what seems like a totally spiritual practice, but if you're doing it in such a way that you can do it in an egoic way or you can do it in a non-spiritual way or whatever. So there's no guarantee that a particular practice is going to be, this is what the Buddha talks about upaya, which is skillful means, and why they describe the Buddha as a physician, because he has many, many different things for different types of people. And so to the nihilists, he talks about the Tathagata, which is, infinitely, alive and luminous and conscious. And to the people that believe in the soul, he talks about the emptiness and talks about emptiness. So it's like an emptiness and total fullness are the same.
Yeah.
So this is like, it's just everybody has an appropriate remedy for
Yeah.
them. And
Like
so
you were saying about the Saturn and Mars being sort of tempered by putting them in the sort of maybe not opposite, but like another kind of element. I wonder, like, what you're speaking to is just like not sort of like falling into the motions or just falling asleep while you're doing the practices, not falling asleep literally, but just like you can sit down every day to like meditate, but not be meditating, or you can, go through the rhythm of a yoga practice or something and not really let it sort of penetrate you in any type of way. And maybe you might stumble upon a moment of meditation or stumble upon some kind of like benefit from hitting the mat or whatever. But you're saying like try to maybe make, by bringing consciousness to it, you're trying to make it more alive and sort of wanting to be influenced and affected.
here's what I would say. There is this tremendous desire to be doing something and accomplishing things, and that there's a tremendous desire to see the right way and a wrong way. And I'm like, it's all the same, you
Mm.
know? I mean, obviously that as when we see the difference between right and wrong, we want to do right,
Mhm.
given the where we're at. But ultimately, it doesn't matter whether you wake up or not. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. And trying, it's a certain point is an expression of ego. And so it's just like it just be what you are. That's the saddest thing. It's like our cat, for example, he's so lucky because he um he gets to go out whenever he wants, you know, and he can run around and he can be himself. I mean, he's the boss cat of the neighborhood. He's the alpha cat, and he hunts and he does his thing. And it's like, and the saddest thing is like you see a hawk in a cage, right?
It
And
is sad.
so it's like, but if you're a snake, you can't get mad at a snake for not galloping. It's like because a snake doesn't gallop. And so if your dharma is to not wake up, then you be your dharma. It's like that's what I would say. But so there are some people that this is just they hear the stuff and they get an itch and then they get a desire and they just go for it. So that's what that's for. It's like this is for hawks, but it doesn't mean that anything wrong with being a squirrel, and like why can't
Yeah.
I fly and I'm trying really hard and I doing all this stuff and everything. I mean, not everyone who catches the deer, everyone who runs after the deer catches it. I mean, nobody who caught the deer who didn't run after it, right? But you don't have to catch a deer. Do you see what I'm saying? Because like so
Oh,
much of the spiritual
completely.
stuff just totally gets turned into like this like, oh, now you got to do this stuff and we're working on it. We're working really hard and we're going to achieve it. And then we're eventually going to get to X. And it's really more just like, that's it. and a Jnana yoga path and a
Mhm.
wisdom path. This is like just, and if you don't wake up, that's fine too. It's like it's all exactly the same. So it's just like I said, it's sad to have people that aren't themselves, but it's not like, oh, I should be different, you know? And so that's what I would say about it. I mean, like, for example, I have this particular personality and karmic package that, it's funny because like I said, I wrote a book on the law of evictions, right? 50,000 words, right? And I cranked that out in about, 3 or 4 months, and like obviously I had to do a lot of work and knowledge. I mean, it took 10 years of work it's sort of like the bee, gathering the honey and everything.
Mhm.
But and I had this friend of mine say, "Wow, you're so productive." It's that whole like hellhound on my trail thing. I'm like, I just feel like, oh my God, I'm just driven to it. It's just like that's what I am. And so
Mhm.
I crank the stuff out. And it's like, but that's because I don't have a family. That's because I've come up with this environment where I have this fear, right? Where I like, oh my God, I'm gonna die, so I have to do this stuff. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like this is just like but it's who I am. So this is the natural expression of who I am. Now, it's good, I think. I think it's positive to be doing these books on astrology, to be doing all the stuff that I'm doing, but I'm not, it's less and less like that I'm trying to do it, and it's more and more just like it's expressing itself. Now, that being said, it takes a lot of discipline.
Mhm.
I mean, every particular moment, like I could just be doing nothing. But like yesterday, it's like I didn't have any work to do, and I was sitting around, so I started doing more work, started doing inventory. You know what I mean? That's just my natural inclination. So because I'm kind of an imbalance, the more people are good, the more the shadow side. I mean, Martin Luther King, I mean, the more I read about him, the more he just strikes me as such an incredible person. And the nonviolence is not like wimpy, like pushed around stuff. It's incredibly strong
I
but
agree.
wise approach. Yet he had all this crazy sex stuff. He was like sleeping around all over the place. It's like the brighter the bright, the darker the dark. And so it's just inevitable. And, in order for people to accomplish great things, they have to have great deficits as well. So it's just
Yeah.
like a really calm person who's all together isn't going to be doing much. But it's like that's okay too. That's like you have your kids, you have a family, do that. Or, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. It's all just like they're just taking what we have and taking it further. That's their dharma.
I
Sad though.
agree.
I mean,
Like,
there's tying themselves back into samsara. I mean,
mhm.
my preference would be for stuff that is to be awake. You're enlightened right now anyway. I mean, being consciously aware of enlightenment is just that's for some people to do. It's just that's their thing. It's like flowers bloom, right? That's their thing. They do it. I mean, so, but not everyone's you could be a conifer. They don't have any flowers. So
So
it's like,
then there's like people that are attracted to the path, then let's say the astrological path, or they're attracted to the magical path. And of course, there is a plethora of sort of motivators for that, right? It could be I want something, I desire something, or it could be sort of feeling like it's being born out of a natural, it's kind of like arising naturally in them. It sparks their curiosity, interest, it compels them forward, or something like this. So then you're compelled towards this magical work, and then you start to sort of dissect worldview or methodology. And then we find ourselves your students. So let's talk about how do you have, like I know you just said be yourself, let it arise, maybe sit in what's arising naturally, sit in the nature of your essence, and don't try for anything, right?
no,
Um,
it doesn't, it's just none of those are like, it depends on what stage you're at. It depends on what's
yeah,
appropriate. This
yeah.
is like, and there's nowhere to go, but there is a ways to go. It's just like there is, I mean, my it's weird because the astrology, one of the things about celestial way in my book is that, you know, the idea that astrology and magic in the Western tradition could be used as a method of enlightenment. But
Mhm,
I didn't attain the limited sort of taste of enlightenment that I have in through astrology, you
mhm.
know? And that's sort of like a tantric methodology, I think. That's what I would say. It's probably like a Western tantra, you know?
I think so
And
too.
so, but the methodology or the path that I followed was the Jnana Yoga inquiry path. So it was Zen as far as I got, as far as I could with the Western Zen. And then I needed to go back to non-dual, which is also modern, but that's basically has its roots in Advaita Vedanta and Zen. And that's, you know, it's that's a wisdom path. That's an inquiry path.
Mhm.
So, but at the same time, see the balance, the Nana path, you need to have a bhakti path. You need to have a devotional side. And that's one of the things that I provide in the astrology. Plus, like I said, you know, we have an atheistic materialistic worldview, and the atheistic materialistic worldview says nothing exists except matter and energy. Okay. And so if you can see and experience the spiritual, non-energetic and non-material as real, that's exactly what we're talking about with the methodology stuff. So that's what I really pointed to as authentic with the, because I don't want to be putting in my book stuff I haven't experienced myself, you
Mhm.
know? And so what I have experienced is like I said before, that the practice of the conscious practice of magic and astrology can lead to this deeper understanding of the nature of reality. Um,
I think so too.
and I
Whether
think
it
there's
is,
also some tantric stuff in there, like in Picatrix, like the perfect nature stuff, So hopefully somebody will come along and after me and pick that up and take it further. Because that's what you do. Your teachers take it to a certain point and give it to, it's like a baton. They pass it off to you
exactly.
and you run with it for a while and you pass it off to somebody else. And so
Exactly.
that's partly what I tried to do. What I'm finding is that where they disappear somebody and then airbrush their picture out, I'm getting airbrushed out of a lot of the prominent astrological magicians because the reason that they're doing it is because they got the idea from me, right? But and their methodology is different and their thing is different, but let's be honest about it. What was the first thing? Why did you first get interested in this? Oh, I heard about astrological magic, and if you trace that back, it's going to be me. And so
Oh, I know.
that's
That's why
that's what
I'm
I would
so.
say is like really kind of weird. Or people come and say I'm wrong. They look at my like they'll come into my website, they'll look at a chart and they go, that's wrong, you know, saying that I did it wrong. Now you could say I have a different methodology, right? And that's what I agree with because I don't say other people are wrong. I mean, like I said, just because someone has a different way of approaching things, to me, that's not wrong. It really shows a lack of respect to me to say to the guy who got it going in the first place, who's the fundamental set up the fundamental framework that I'm using, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I'm like, that's again a little weird because your methodology, insofar as they're following any medieval Renaissance methodology, is coming from the stuff that I did. Everybody uses my underlying framework, right? Which doesn't mean I own it or I'm the Pope or I get to say what's right or wrong. But I'm just saying, just recognize the architect here. When you're talking about the house, who built the house, and everybody can live in it. That's what's great about the thing now is it's very diverse. You've got this incredible number of different people doing stuff. And so
So then there's an alternative worldview and approach to the battery
there you
model.
go. So here's the thing, modeling. So you can have a spiritual worldview. So what that means is to say that the spiritual is primary, right? If you look at every society except our own, the modern society, they all had a spiritual worldview. They all felt that spiritual was primary and the spiritual permeated everything. And it was actually the most important. So that everything that the physical is real or not. I mean, sometimes they won't say it's not real, but I mean, basically the physical is real, but the spiritual is even more real and it's underlies. But they both exist. So the minimum you can say that there is a spiritual there is something or whatever that is not material and not energetic. Whereas if you go to a scientist and you say, is there anything but matter and energy? Is there any scientific proof of it? They're going to say no. In fact, and if you push them on it, they say, is there anything else? Like, no, not really, and they're polite enough not to say this stuff about God is ridiculous. Or maybe they're confused. I mean, that's another thing too. There's a tremendous amount of confusion about if there's nothing but matter and energy, how's there a God? We have both of them. It's like double think. We have both of those ideas at the same time somehow, you know. But
I think
see,
people are comfortable with giant gaps in their models, like because of whatever, because of society, because of different religion, because of science, atheistic materialism. Like people have been comfortable over however many generations of making these big, unexplainable gaps in their sort of worldview.
well, one of those is what I call the truce. So if you go back to 1700 and the quote Enlightenment, there's some propaganda for you, the Enlightenment. Um, what happened was the elites stopped believing in the spiritual, that the mechanistic model, the model of only matter and energy exists, took over among the elites. But the compromise that was made unconsciously was that the atheistic materialism would determine the ultimate nature of reality, but you would be allowed to say you
Mhm.
believed in God. And you could continue these religious practices and no one's going to call you on it. you know? And so that's the truth. So you go to church on Sunday and oh, we believe in God, blah, blah, blah. And then you go back to work and then then you're, back to atheistic materialism. And it's also revealed by stuff like, for example, they found the sarcophagus in Israel, and it had said Jesus, son of, Joseph on it in Aramaic. And so everyone was so happy because it proved Jesus, because it was a physical artifact, and that's the highest level of proof, right? So if physically is true, then it's true. That's
Mm-hmm.
atheistic materialist,
Mm-hmm.
because the spiritual reality to us in a spiritual world, the spiritual is actually higher. It's more perfect. You think of a
Mm-hmm.
triangle. If you have a triangle in mind, right, and you try to draw it, it's always going to be when you draw, it's always going to be imperfect compared to the one in mind. And then the one in mind is not as perfect as the Platonic idea of triangle. That's where you're getting
Right.
triangle from in the first place. It's less perfect. So what's the truer one? Is it the imperfect physical one, or is it the Platonic idea is actually the most true Platonic idea? So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't depend on the physical. So I don't need to go out and find a physical, triangle. Oh, look, triangles really exist. See, I found a physical one. So it's like, so that's, you see what I'm saying? This is the whole difference
Mm-hmm.
in the thought process and the automatic view of it. So the modern methodology is kind of layered over the top of these kind of split atheistic materialistic and maybe some spirit, because spirit, it's not like a labeling, because I do that myself. I label atheistic materialism. Well, really, we're talking about the gravitational pull, that you've got this heavy gravitational pull of atheistic materialism, and people will have spiritual stuff as well, because that also is exerting a pull on people. So that's a much more sophisticated model, and I need to keep thinking in that model of like, yes, people are strongly influenced by atheistic materialism, yet they're also influenced by spiritual stuff as well, right? But typically, it doesn't tend to be in a very thoughtful or a conscious way. But people definitely are influenced by, like, angels. Like, okay, angels, yeah, sure, angels, but it's still a talisman, it's still a battery. You
Yeah.
know, you have this kind of combination of different things, and it's like, which is fine, but it's just like I like to understand things in a more coherent way, but that's just my thing. This is like,
No,
I
I'm
happen to
me
like
too.
chocolate, yeah, exactly. But see, we have to be careful not to say that that has some value other than sort of practical or for us, that it's all objectively correct. It's like, nah, not really. It's like it's
Yeah.
perfectly fine to be kind of like the average person wants to do it their way. That's okay. That's fine.
Yeah, and I think actually, to go back a little bit to what you said is just giving you that honor for sort of like, I see you as a pioneer in the field of this work. That's why I feel very, very honored that you'd come to talk with us about it, and why I kind of want to prod some more and some deeper, or not that you're not deep, you're always deep, get into it a little bit more because you have had an influence on the culture from its ground level, from its fundamental level. And one thing that I admire about you, and obviously you said in our last interview, and I get this as a Saturn world person, part of it is just to like mitigate blowback or whatever, but it's like you always tell us it's not this way or that way. It's not wrong. It's not right. It's a preference like ice cream. It's like I prefer to like consolidate my worldview as much as possible. I'm not comfortable with these big gaps in sort of like, you know,
That's
my
just it's just that
religion versus.
I like that. I mean, I think seems to me that, I mean, let's put this way, I mean, I'm an attorney. And not just an attorney, I'm an appellate attorney. And when an appellate attorney, what you need to do is you have to be able to go into the Supreme Court and be able to explain stuff very rigorously, and you can get away with a certain amount of stuff even at the trial court, but that's way more rigorous than you're going to get the average person. I mean, a court, you're going to have to prove, you have to provide evidence for all the facts that you try to present. And if you don't have proof, they're not accepted as facts. And any legal argument you want to make, you need to point to an authority for that. You need to point to like a case, or you need to point to a statute, or have the logical extension of a principle that's articulated in those things. Now, that doesn't always happen at the trial level. It doesn't always happen at the Supreme Court. But once you get to the Supreme Court, you got to brief, you got to write this stuff, this rigorous process. And so that's part of what I tried to bring to the now the alternative in the modern stuff would be academic approach, because this is what I said, you kind of have this choice between this sort of like loosey-goosey intuitive approach I'm going to talk about, and then the other one is what I would call the source fascist. And what the
Mm,
source fascist does is they open up Picatrix and they say, well, Picatrix says this, and I was like, okay, why? I mean, but I said, well, Picatrix says Picatrix says yes on one page and Picatrix says no on the other. What are you going to do about that? That just blows their mind. I mean, all they can do is say it says this. I'm like, why do you have to follow that? Because you have to. The book says so.
Mm.
Why do you follow it? Because the book says so. It's like, why not? What if you change it? Oh, that's bad. You have to
Yeah.
follow the rules. You're going to get in trouble. And that's the basic stance of the source fascist. And the problem that they get themselves into is the sources are contradictory.
Yeah,
And it's the same
absolutely.
problem with lawyers. See, because people think the law is a bunch of rules and that's just this inflexible rule that covers everything. I'm like, that's not
Mm.
reality. You get in a situation where you're half this and half that. What do you do? Law is actually about getting the essence. Like I said, you need to be able to understand, read the statute and understand the essential purpose of that statute. Um, you need to be able to reconcile contradictory statutes or contradictory precedent. You need to be able to understand the purpose, and then you also have to do, you got a practical decision making for the individual situation. So that's what I feel like I'm doing with astrology as well.
I was
So
gonna
it's a
say
much
that
more
to me.
rigorous,
Yeah. Mhm.
approach than just like, oh, that's what the book Picatrix says. Because I see people doing that. Here's the thing about Picatrix, because I'll talk about this a little bit. Because people, there's these people going around saying Picatrix says, like, it's like God says so, and we have to follow
Mhm.
it. The problem is Picatrix says it's a compilation. Okay, he says I looked at over 200 books to put together, and you can see he'll say, "Oh, this is what Plato says," or this is so he's citing all sorts of different sources, right? And so the rules for one source, they have nothing to do with the rules in another source. It's not like it's all like Three Books of Occult Philosophy. Agrippa did kind of sort of systematize things a bit more, not completely, but Picatrix is not systematized at all. It's like 200, it's just citing stuff all over the place. And
Mhm.
so if you were going to try to follow every single rule in Picatrix, you could never do anything and they'd be contradictory. You'd have 100 things you'd have to have in every election, and they wouldn't make any sense. They don't fit each. Like for example, Picatrix says in one section, we're talking about elections, it says don't have the moon rising because it makes things happen really quickly. They don't last very long. So don't have the moon rising because they make things last long. So people turn that into never have the moon rising.
Mhm.
Like, and every single election for any kind of talisman, anything is bad if the moon is rising. I'm like, yeah, except in this other section, book uh book 2 chapter 10, it says to make a moon talisman when the moon's rising. And it's like, wait a second, what you're not getting is first of all, if you could even reconcile them on their own terms, because it says you don't want stuff to last very long. It doesn't mean it's inherently wrong, right? It's just the moon's influence is short term. So moon rising isn't necessarily evil. It's just for that particular purpose. If you're doing an election, the other thing is to say, understand these are two different sources, right?
Yeah.
There's not an objective one reality you're dealing with. So it's like if I'm making a moon talisman and I'm following what I have is this thing I call it a module approach. I say, look at the section. You'll notice that they'll cite a discrete number of factors to use that fit together. Like, for example, there's a section on moon signs. So they went the moon, and you look at what you look at the election is the moon and the moon sign it's in, and then the moon's place in the chart. And
Mhm.
that's the factors that you use for the election. And if, for example, if you want to do something for, you know, farming, you do it in an earth sign like Virgo. So moon and Virgo rising. Okay, there you go. That's good for like a talisman or whatever for planting. But see how it fits. Whereas the book 2, chapter 10 module says, okay, to make a planetary talisman, make with the planet in sign or exaltation, rising or culminating, planetary hour, and unafflicted, right?
Mhm.
So that's a discrete number of factors that will give you a strong talisman. If you follow that, you won't have it won't be made, can't be afflicted. It'll give strong, but it's actually doable. So like I said, it's practical, it's doable, it's strong. That's a module. But if you try to use everything together, it's like sports. I've got a book on sports. I use every single sports rule from every single sport in everything. I'm like, what? It doesn't make any sense, you know?
Yeah, it is about skill, I think, and also wisdom, because I don't know if this would be the same approach with law, but I see this with like astrological wisdom. So you have Maternus, you have Valens, you have the Picatrix saying a couple different things. It's about kind of applying the wisdom of the principle, like you were saying, is like understanding the underlying principle of what they're trying to tell you, and then applying that when that principle is needed to the chart or whatever. That's the idea of like making a judgment or being a skilled astrologer, is that we have to sort of understand the underlying principles and then know when to use them.
My view is that the schools are like a language,
Hmm.
right? And each
Hmm.
language, you wouldn't say, oh, that the best you can speak the best if you have German nouns. English verbs and Spanish adverbs, because those are
Right.
the best. So if you're separately the best, I put them together, they're obviously even better, right? And they work by themselves. It's like, it's not that no individual word has meaning in relationship to other words in that language, right? Not by
Mhm.
itself,
Right.
you know? And so that's
Absolutely.
what I would say about the techniques. Each school has its own more or less internally consistent methodology,
That's
right?
right.
And so the modern methodology is that you can take pieces from every other school. So it's like that's fine in the modern methodology. If you're gonna, but recognize that that is itself a methodology, and that and the other schools don't work that way. You know,
Right.
that's just like
Yes.
a difference in the thing. And there's no astrology. There's no object. It's just like science is objective reality. What objective reality? I mean, I see no evidence of objective reality. All we have is our subjective understanding of it. So how do we know there's even objective reality at all? We don't.
Yeah.
All we have is our subjective experience. So to say there's the thing about science too is it's like, well, there's only one right answer. They keep changing it constantly. Like, is cholesterol good for you or bad for you? I mean, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, new study, blah, 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 it's in constant flux. I mean, there's only one truth, but it's constantly in flux. It's like, I don't think so. I don't buy it. And it's like, the thing about it is again, my view is there's no one right answer. There's a couple of sort of right answers, and there's an infinite number of wrong ones, you
Yeah.
know? And that's, we just want to find a methodology that is appropriate for us, that's not too wrong, you
Right.
know? And then that's what we do, but recognize that that's what you've got as opposed to the God's own truth, and
Yeah.
that, and so that's what I would say about it is that, when I look at, you know, if you look at Hellenistic astrology, it is a school and it
Exactly.
has
Yeah.
an internally coherent methodology. But even within that school, the masters are going to differ,
Well, that's
right?
what I meant
And
about
so
Firmicus Maternus versus Valens. It's
yeah,
like both
right.
of them
This
are
is gonna be, you're just going to
Hellenistic.
roll with those guys and say, well, I'm using this. Now, if you're thinking you can make your own, because you can. I mean, if you look at medieval Renaissance astrology, what is that originally 8th and 9th century, 10th century, you've got these brilliant astrologers, Abu Mashar, Mashallah, people like that, that took the Hellenistic astrology plus Persian astrology and probably a little bit of Vedic, and they synthesized it and came up with this new style that's medieval Renaissance. Now, if I'm not that brilliant, I haven't come up with a new style. I just follow what everybody else did because it makes sense to me. You know what I mean? I just happen to like it, but I'm not making my own stuff up. I don't think that I'm doing that, right? So in
Hmm.
modern natal astrology, the entire chart is important, right? Because it represents some part of the person's life, right? So the entire chart is important, right? And so if you move into like horary or electional, you don't look at the entire chart. All you do is you look at pieces of it, right? And separating and applying aspects are big difference from each other. So this is what I would say. So when you look at a talismanic chart, what people do is they start, for example, most people other than me that sell talismans do not put the charts up anymore. And the reason they don't is because the customers immediately start looking at that and they want to do a chart synastry. And when you make a talisman, you're picking a time that's strong for that factor, the chosen factor. That's it. That's all you're concerned about. You don't worry about the rest of the chart. It's not used. The rest of the chart's not used. Just like in horary. The model I'm going from is a devotional model where I'm contacting Saturn. So it's like if I want an election to call up a friend of mine, right? It doesn't change my friend. It just is a good time to get in touch with them. And
Right.
that's what I say about the talisman is that talisman is what the talisman is a way to communicate with the spirit, in my view, right? If you look at it from a devotional approach, no, you can't control that. You're going to control Saturn. You're going to make Saturn do certain things just because you made it at a particular time. Really? The archangel of the planet, incredible, powerful being, 7 rulers of the sublunary realm. You control that? It's like, okay. I mean, it's just like but that's from I'm coming from a devotional perspective. Like if you come from a battery perspective, it makes sense. But I don't go around saying to the battery people, that's 100% wrong, get out of here. I'm just like, that's just a different approach. Now I could complain about it a little bit and say, look, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in certain ways, but
And you're
it
just
doesn't mean
bringing
it's
light to
wrong.
you're bringing light to the different senses and different approaches because it will actually matter once the person approaches their magic. So it's not at all like disparaging. It's actually helping people because that'll help you as you sort of, like you said, come into your own nature, allow yourself your own practice. You're coming into your worldview, and you'll want to know those distinctions. Um, and this kind of celestial in your book The Celestial Way, you talk a lot about worldview. So we're saying then, or as you said, it's an approach to like a cosmic being. It's a powerful being, and we're approaching them in order to have some kind of communion with them. Talking about occult virtue. Can you elaborate on that?
So one of the direct models, which I was talking about, is the stuff is caused directly by spirits. And I have on my website a page from the Ikhwan Safa, the Brethren of Purity, which was a sort of his about 12th century Ismaili group. And they wrote this encyclopedia of esoteric topics. And what the quote actually comes from this translation of the Arabic Picatrix in the beginning of it, and they translated it. And so it talks about like the angels of Saturn doing a lot of stuff. They do it directly. So
Mm-hmm.
like, things that are heavy, that's because of Saturn angels. You know what I mean? And it kind of reminds me, there's a sort of, it's apocryphal, but this idea, it's pops up in Kabbalistic stuff. They said there's not, for every blade of grass, there's a guardian angel saying to it, grow, grow, you know? So it's like, that's to me how I see it, or that the grass itself is an angel, you know? And so that's one way. Now, the problem with that is that there's demons. And so they're like, oh shit, if anytime you do astrological magic, it's demonic. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. But that was the problem that they caught a lot of shit in the Middle Ages, because if you're using that direct spiritual causality, oh, it must be demonic. And so they were at great pains not to be saying that. And so that's why people like Albertus Magnus or Marsilio Ficino preferred to use a natural magic methodology, because they were really concerned that they were going to be accused of dealing with demons. And so the natural magic approach is one that dovetails really well with atheistic materialism for different reasons. Because atheistic materialism is not worried about demons, right? But in a way they are. I mean, if you talk about quantum mechanics, right, there's all sorts of weird stuff at a quantum level. You have action at a distance. You have stuff happening before having the effect cut before the cause. You have all sorts of weird stuff. But what you do not have is personalities. It's all impersonal forces. And the biggest sin is to start talking about personalities. That's just wrong scientifically. You cannot go there. You can do all you want with quantum mechanics, but don't start talking about angels or anything like that. That's really verboten. And so again, we're kind of still under the spell of that, not wanting to have any spiritual personalities. So then you do the rays thing. That's what you know. So Al-Kindi talk about the stellar rays. So that's another traditional thing. Now, here's the thing about those rays, though. That's based on light, okay? Not energetic fields, not magnetism, not science fields. So the light rays, they have a living quality to them. They have a consciousness quality to them. They have an awareness quality to them that's not present in the modern stuff. Okay. So when we talk about rays, it seems like, oh yeah, energy. Yeah, I could do that. It's different. It has some similarities, but an overlap, but it actually has a lot of differences as well. And so, I mean, I looked up crystal healing, and people are like, yeah, energy for real. They're like, quartz is used in watches to store energy. And that's exactly what we're doing. It's totally scientific. That is problematic, because the scientists can tell you that's garbage. There's no scientific evidence for crystal healing or chakra cleansing or any of that sort of stuff at all. It's not electromagnetic receptive. It's nothing that's detected scientifically. See? But since people are so set on, I mean, the scientists are the high priest of our culture. If it's not scientifically valid, it's not valid at all. It's not true. It's false. And so, it's what Christian Science, Scientology. I mean, these are religions that borrow the prestige of science, because that's who has the prestige, who's the truth setter, because the ultimate, again, atheistic materialism, they determine the nature of reality. And so the ray stuff is out there, but it's different. Now, the other one, the occult virtue, is interesting, is occult virtue is a third type of causality. So if you look at the traditional view, you think of like matter, everything that's material is composed of the four elements. Okay, air, earth, fire, and water. And not dirt, right? Or like liquid water, but we're talking about states of matter. Okay, so earth is solid, water is liquid, air is like a gas, right? And then fire is like plasma or energized or fire, right? These are states of matter. And everything has different combinations of it. And they exist in in the celestials, and also in the heavens as well. So they're spiritual principles, and even like dirt is going to have earth element in it, but it's wet. It's also got some heat in it. It's also got some air in it. You see what I'm saying? Everything's a combination of the elements. So when you're talking about talismans and celestial stuff, though, those are not elemental for the most part. I mean, Ptolemy started talking about heat and everything, but for the most part, when you're talking about the powers of the celestials that come through the celestials, we're talking about occult virtue. Now, that has to be translated to modern speech because occult doesn't mean evil or malefic, it just means hidden. And virtue doesn't mean anything morally, or it just means powers. So we're talking about hidden powers. So these are hidden powers, not elemental powers. They're also not stuff that's obvious from looking at something. It's hidden. So the occult virtues, ultimately, the source of the occult virtue is in the one. Okay, everything exists in a perfect and unified state in the one. Okay, it then manifests as perfect but differentiated state in the archetypes, the intelligences, or the Platonic ideas. Those are different labels for basically the same thing. So it could be an angel or a Platonic idea, archetype, all basically the same thing. Then manifests in the soul of the world as what are called seminal ideas. Like, think of a seed, it has everything in it to be a tree. You know what I mean? Ash seed, it's 100-foot tall tree, right? Comes out of this little seed. So that's like the seed ideas of things. You think the essence of something. Those seed ideas then manifest through the celestials with all sorts of incredible interconnections and chains and all sorts of mixing and everything. It's very complex. That's why you need to be a mage. The mage is the one that figures out the interconnections of things. It's not straightforward. So then it manifests in the signs and fixed stars, and then in the planets, right? And then in the things in the sublunary realm. So like the daemons, the intermediate spirits, then in humans, then in animals, then in plants, then in stones, if you're going to follow that great chain of being sort of concept. So what those occult virtues are, though, is the Platonic ideas. They're the actual physical manifestation of the Platonic ideas, right? And they go through the chains. So a good example of it, an intermediate between the celestials and the humans, for example, are forms, mathematics, and ratios and images. Okay, so those are intermediate. And so that's why if you make a talisman, if you have an image on it, it has the power of that particular celestial, that idea, because it's in a form. And doesn't mean physical form, that's the lowest level of it, but it's also a ratio. And, like you think of like pi. I mean, what's pi? It's a ratio, but it's pervades all things. All circles have pi in them. The golden mean, it's got that doorway sort of, the sacred geometry stuff. So those are pretty incredible. And so when you think about the Platonic ideas, there's this tendency of ghostly stuff somewhere else. It's like, no, it's right here. And a good example of a way to look at it is like relationships. If you think about and that's like Ibn Arabi, who's a Sufi mystic, talks about the 99 beautiful names of God. I mean, that's pretty of Allah. There's a lot of use of that, but the 99 beautiful names of God are all relationships. So like Arab, which is the Lord, is you have to have, if Allah is the Lord, you have to have a servant, right? And that's that relationship of Lord to servant. But without the servant, there's no Lord. So there's a reciprocal relationship there, and it always exists. Life is undifferentiated and differentiates to this underlying inherent patterning that's already present. Those are the Platonic ideas, right? It's not a thing. It's not a forcible thing. It's just the underlying inherent patterning of things that just is always there, always exists, whether there's matter fulfilling it at that point or not. And it was funny. I was thinking about evolution. Now I was reading this book was talking about the Earth when the bacteria started being photosynthetic, right? It's like 2 billion years ago. And so the writer is a scientist. He starts off saying, well, of course it was random. There's no, it's just random here. And then he starts talking about, all the, like he says, okay, so he said, if you think about it, in order to have photosynthesis, it comes from these certain enzymatic pathways. And he says they're actually not that complicated. So you can make changes. And he says, so think about this. When I was a teenager, I had this 1949 truck. And he said it was very primitive, but it could do what you needed for a truck. And he said, but it had these, it had a radiator, it had a carburetor, it had an engine and everything. But nowadays they're much more complicated. And so he's doing this whole metaphor about trucks and how the trucks change through small changes, change into these bigger trucks. I'm like, the problem you got there is somebody had to think that out, right? There's an intelligence involved there. That change from the creation of that 1949 truck and the change into the other ones wouldn't happen without intelligence. Now you could do creationism, but God is not tinkering with that. The bacteria is intelligent. There's an intelligence in the bacteria. I mean, think of COVID. was constantly like every time you come up with a vaccine, it was constantly changing. It's like it changing to fit the vaccine. And it was passing genetic material around so that they all the COVID would have the same powers. Like it was really smart. It fought off the humans. It still is around, right? That's intelligent. Another book I was reading again by another scientist was talking about pine trees. And pine trees evolved before the flowering trees. Conifers were there before the angiosperms. And so, but the angiosperms were able to reproduce really well. They had, the flowers and everything. They're just much more evolutionary, able to, compete. So the conifers, they like said, the conifers decided to basically go up on mountains and go into places where there's forest fires because they could reproduce. Their whole reproductive cycle involves, forest fires. And so, so I'm like, yeah, they're intelligent. They thought about it. They did it. But if you ask the guy about that, he's, oh no, I didn't really mean that. Like, what do you mean? That's a perfectly good model for understanding how they're interacting, right? It's the same thing with even humans. I mean, I'm a human. It's like if you look at the Buddhist view, there's no self, right? It's this illusionary stringing together of these, of sensation and everything and mind stream and everything like that. And it's like, so, but it's a perfectly good way to interact with other people as a person. But it's also a perfectly good way to interact with these spiritual forces, it's an interface. So, but you can look at it as an impersonal force, but you could also look at it as a personality too. So that's what I would say about it is that, as you think about all these things, it's like, oh, okay. And I've expressed it in sort of more modern terms. So it's a little more able for people to understand. But when you start thinking about it and modeling it and applying that, you're like, okay, that model actually works really well. And that's maybe a superior way of understanding it. And by taking the spiritual out, I'm depriving myself of that understanding of that inherent power. And that's the problem with anything after 1700, any philosophy, science, or anything like that. It's like you got your head in a sack and your arms tied behind your back trying to understand stuff. Because once you abstract the spiritual from it, it makes it extremely hard to understand what the hell's going on at the time. But if you put that into your modeling, right, you're like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And that's the thing with Platonic ideas. It's like, why is 1 + 1 = 2? No matter what I have, if I got a pen plus this, it's going to be 2, right? Why is every time I use that, it's always 2? Why is the inherent reality of the universe that 1 + 1 always equals 2? Why doesn't it change around? Maybe it is changing around. We don't know about it, but I'm just saying in the reality we're in, it stays the same. Why is that? It's not, is it matter? What? I don't know. I don't think so. It's an inherent quality of, and that's the thing about number. I mean, scientists try to take mathematics as somehow validating atheistic materialism. It doesn't. It's Platonic. Mathematics is so mind, so patterned, it's not scientific at all. Same thing with engineering. I was reading a book about engineering. And they're like, engineering's not scientific. We just do bunches of rules of thumb. We're constantly just like kind of basically, winging it. We know the kind of, like for example, they're talking about cathedrals. And they said if you measure it so that, this particular ratio of the width of the wall stays within a percentage of the height, then it won't fall down. And that's what they used. But they didn't have like, oh, we understand the nature of, the granite and all the scientific observation and stuff like that. They just like, okay, we just use a rule of thumb and we change it around. So they have this really built up knowledge of how to, practical knowledge, but they typically don't need to have the underlying assumptions of it. And so it's not scientific. It's not. I read a book about divine engineers saying this is not science, but they glom onto it for prestige purposes. And the reason people believe in science and atheistic materialism is because of plasma screen TVs and internet and all that sort of stuff. There's an interesting, I was reading about Alexandria. This is because Alexandria is, it's on the Nile. It's an incredible city during the Hellenistic and the Roman period. It's kind of like modern in a lot of ways because you have this incredible mixing of cultures. And so there's a period where it changes over from being Roman, pagan over to Christian. It's like about the 200 or 300. And the Hypatia, you may have heard of Hypatia. She was martyred. She was a pagan philosopher. But anyhow, there's a point at which there's this huge temple of Serapis, who was the god who was extremely important to the Ptolemies. And the Christians decide they're going to take down the temple. So they go in and they scare everybody off and they drag the statue out and they, beat it, break it to pieces and desecrate the temple and stuff. And the reaction of most Alexandrians, even the ones who were pagans, was sort of like, well, the god didn't protect himself. Must not be a very good god. And that's what's going to happen to science. When the climate change hits, when it all shit hits the fan, when the stuff falls apart, we have famines and wars and stuff way beyond what we've got now. science, the prestige of science is going to go away because it'll be obviously seen to not have worked. It'll be seen as a failure. And it's similar to what happened with the Maya, right? Incredible civilization that it's, they fell apart. And so the longer term way to go was in small villages. The same thing with the Anasazi. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. In the Hohokam, they got these or the same thing with Mississippian culture. They got this incredibly complex culture, but it didn't last because it just was, it was overburdening the soil, the social conditions, everything like that. And it wasn't long, if you think about the Pueblo, that's a long-term balance approach to living in that particular environment, right? And that's what I would say about science is it's not balanced. We needed it to get to the internet and do all this stuff, but it's complete lack of balance, and that's ultimately why it's going to crash. And when it does, then it won't have the prestige anymore. And then we'll go back to this stuff. I mean, this hopefully will be around and there'll be enough people that are aware of it. And we'll be able to kind of find it because it's natural. I mean, like I think of my wife, for example, they call it animism, but really that's not believing, but seeing and feeling and touching and experiencing everything as being alive. And she has it very naturally and never lost, even as a child, she never lost it all the way up to, and that helped me because that's where I'm at too. And so that's the natural state of things. It's just sad that people's philosophy doesn't go in line with what their heart says to them. Because I think a lot of people understand reality as being alive, and but you constantly have type of anthropomorphism and that's wrong and that's animism and all this sort of stuff, and it's like, it's just sad that people's natural inclinations are shut down by the philosophy and by the official, reality. Oops, I lost your sound. I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now? Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
can hear
can.
you.
Okay, I can hear
Can
you
you hear
now.
me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I wanted to talk to you about that as far as rule of thumb, because I know like animism, we talked about this last time, and I feel like your wife that I was sort of born this way. And I was very challenging, even 5 or 6 years old, kind of like wondering, asking, challenging. It was perceived as a challenge. I didn't like that. But as a rule of thumb, when we're talking about like the occult virtue or this sort of hidden power, hidden quality in something, is it an okay rule of thumb, or would it be a good place for people to start, or in the Warnock worldview, where as a rule of thumb or as sort of a guideline, if you think about things as alive, like a personification of a blade of grass, oh, the little grass is alive, or this relationship that we're talking about is building a relationship with these things, like a living ecosystem. Would a good rule of thumb perhaps be to think of things as alive and personified and in
I mean,
relationship?
what I would say about it is this, is that it's good not to try to make everything up yourself, you know, because if you do that, then you end up just replicating the sort of half-assed, sort of like modern, caricature of it. You know what I mean? And there's this
Mhm.
thing of like people have such arrogance that, oh, I'm just like Plato, I can just make this stuff up. It's like you can't. You know what I mean? So for example, the Shinto approach is very much comes from that approach, is everything is alive. And
Mhm.
so I mean, I'm very much guided by that. You know
Me
what I mean?
too.
And like
Yeah.
I want to be acting within a tradition. I haven't initiated in Shinto, but I mean, I guess I spent enough time in Japan and I got other initiations. So, but my general rule is that I like to be initiated in a tradition, you know,
Mhm.
and then I kind of do my own thing within it, but nevertheless, I want to stay within the guidance of it. I just think it's useful. I don't see it as like controlling me necessarily or binding me. I just see it as a, I mean, why do I want to reinvent the wheel? I mean, we don't make up our own
Yeah.
language. I mean, you can change words and stuff and come up with new slang. That's fine. But the underlying rules of it, the rules, you follow them because it's useful. So that's what I would say
Yeah,
about these
and
religious
it's
and
supportive
spiritual traditions.
actually. Like if you
Yeah.
find the right language and you find the right kind of like supports your inclination or your kind of like worldview or your sort of proclivity, it supports you in being able to sort of speak that language. And, so I guess if someone wanted, we're probably coming from a lot of different, like maybe worldviews or maybe like kind of like structure as far as like Shinto or Zen or Shaivism or goddess worship or something like that. And then you have this frame, and as you're working in that frame, and as you're approaching like a talisman, or you're approaching sort of a ritualistic practice or a magical practice, or as you're approaching astrology, can a rule of thumb then be to sort of like, we want to make ourselves more alive to the moment in order to bring in that consciousness. Can we then personify things around us as alive to sort of bring in that
I mean, it's useful.
consciousness?
It's an interface.
Yeah, it's an
It's just like I
interface.
said, you go on and use a browser, you need a browser to access the internet,
Yeah.
and you can use different browsers. I mean,
Hmm.
if I happen to like Firefox, okay, I'll use Firefox. You know what I mean? It's sort of like that's what I'd say about it is just like if that's congenial to you, then that's a useful approach. And it's like I think that, you know, it's interesting. I like the Japanese approach because they're not talking about sentient beings because everything is alive.
Yeah, everything.
They don't differentiate, there's this great news story. They're talking about this Japanese extermination company, and they at the end of the year they would go to the Shinto temple and they would offer prayers and not sacrifices, but offerings and everything for all the bugs they killed.
Yeah, I
I was
remember you
like,
telling
that's
that
really
story. I
cool.
love that.
I
It
was
is
like
cool.
that. I was like, that's really cool, and it's um I have a big rock in my yard, and I have a shiminawa, which is like this kind of rope. It looks like sort of big thick rope around it, and it has this shide, which is kind of like a Shinto stuff, but that basically use that to differentiate sacred space. And so they'll put it on trees or rocks or whatever, on temples or I mean or shrines or whatever. And
Hmm.
so that's where the kami, that's where the spirit of my neighborhood is. And there's lots of like, it's funny because the Roman stuff, the Lares, they're like manifest as snakes. And so there's a lot of snakes that are around that thing. So it's like, yeah, I mean, I was gasho to the snakes. It's just one of those things. It's like, if that's your thing, that's your thing. And it's like, because I saw somebody today, they were like, this email, and they were like, magic isn't just begging gods for favors. And I was like, no, that's true, but isn't not begging gods for favors either, which is basically like my devotional approach is not begging gods. That's kind of a pejorative way of putting it, but it's not inaccurate. It's like the other thing I would say though about the devotional approach is like if you're trying to get stuff done, then maybe the devotional approach isn't what people automatically think of because you don't ask for stuff as much. I mean, you
Right.
can, but it's like prayer. If you want to pray to do a novena for someone to be healed, you recognize that you're not necessarily going to happen. It's worthwhile to ask and pray, but you understand prayer doesn't work 100% of the time because it's depending on, you can't force the Virgin Mary to do anything, and you can't get off in a huff because she doesn't get you what you want. It works sometimes. It's
Yeah.
all sorts of ways of doing it. There's a Sufi story about this, Sufi saint, and he's like says to Allah, he's like, if you don't give me this, then I'm gonna, like somebody wanted to help somebody, I'm gonna go like smash up all the lamps in the mosque, and it happened, it's like, which is a funny way of like, kind of harassing God, but it's like so every yes there's a no to, but that's what I would say about it is that if, however, you're in the point of demanding stuff from spirits and you only want certain things, you're going to be sucked into demon stuff because that's what demons promise to people. And the problem with demons is you can't trust demons. That's the thing is like maybe you don't get what you want from angels, but the blowback is less. The problem with demons is they'll play tricks on you and they'll mess with you and they'll lead you astray. Whereas the angels, maybe you don't get what you want, but at least you get to hang out with them,
And
and maybe
sometimes
you
what
don't
we
need
want
that
maybe
stuff.
is not the best.
And that's what they say. That's bullshit. Give me what I want. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I understand that perspective, but it's like what I'm saying about that perspective is like for me, it's dangerous. I'm a very right-hand path person, and it's like, but if that's what, if that, give me what I want, what I want. Now, this people that have this approach, I noticed they're not billionaires. I noticed they're not king of the world. So it doesn't seem like that approach is necessarily going to make them super powerful. I had someone tell me about, they said, oh, in Indonesia, they're so powerful. I said, how come they don't rule the world? They like they're guaranteed, they guarantee with your effects, and it always works. I said, really? How come they're not billionaires? This is
Well,
like,
maybe the goal is different because I
no, I
had
mean,
the
these are straight up like, what I'm talking, like you can pay them. You pay, it's
right,
like total like folk magician. You pay them, you get results. It's like, oh, it really
right.
works. I'm like, I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm just saying it's not all powerful. Nothing's all powerful. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so to claim that particular methodology is all, I mean, I get that a lot of times people say, oh, I used to do this person and everything I asked for, I got. And now I say, well, go back to, like, oh, they're gone. So why can't, and they'll be saying that about Warnock, like, oh, Warnock, he would do all this stuff. He could predict anything. It's like, I mean, I don't get everything right. I mean, I do pretty well, but it's like I get stuff wrong in my readings. It's like, that's not great for business necessarily that I'm not 100%, but it's true. Like, when is an economist 100% right? Does a lawyer win every case? Does a doctor cure everybody? Doesn't mean it's invalid because it's not 100%.
Yeah, and
But
it's generally the interpretive value that you miss, not the planets. It's like the planets weren't wrong, like the
sometimes
person.
they are. Sometimes the chart's just off. It's just wrong. Doesn't always. I mean, yeah. I mean, a lot of the time it's because I, did it one way. But you look at that chart. There's no way you're going to get that result out of that chart.
That's
And
really
what
interesting.
that tells you is this: is that. See, again, this is the theory: is that because what is it? Is how does the chart work? Is it beams? Like I said, because I have people coming to me, they're like, I need my chart remediated because Saturn's in my seventh, so it's messing me up, and I need to deal with Saturn. I need to get rid of Saturn, take care of him. I'm like, I don't think Saturn's messing with you. He's a messenger, right? He's
Yeah.
not actually actively beaming you, messing with you. So my view of it is that it's Plotinus, is that the stars are not the causes, direct causes. They're everything's one, so you can read one thing. Like if you have yellow skin, you have jaundice. The yellow skin's not causing the jaundice. Everything's connected. So the cycles of the heavens are very regular. We can go back 10,000 years or 10,000 years in the future, and we can know exactly where the planets are going to be. So they're very, very regular. They're very, very accurate reflection of the underlying spiritual cycles, right? So,
Mhm.
and those spiritual cycles are what actually is determining, the events that happen on Earth, right? And so, um, but the thing is, if you think about it, it's like the planets and celestials are like, like you think of electromagnetic spectrum, right? You can only see visible light from like, blue or purple light to yellow light, right? You can't see the rest of that spectrum. So that's what you get with a chart is you're getting a limited spectrum of the spiritual cycles that are in play, right?
Mhm.
So there's other stuff going on that we can't see and that's another thing people go, oh, I can see everything. I know everything. I'm like, no, you get a limited view and then you have to try to interpret it. Because that's another thing that again, modern view is that it doesn't work. The techniques work by themselves. They're algorithms. You just put them in the computer, crank them out, and I'll be able to predict everything. Never works because you have to have the combination of the astrologer and the technique, right? The intuition and judgment of the astrologer is absolutely key, right? And some people do it without it. I mean, you have a psychic. There's people that are very accurate psychics or modern natal. They don't have much technique, but they're really very intuitive. They can be very, very accurate,
Mhm.
right? The medieval Renaissance, one of the advantages of medieval Renaissance is that it gives you a tremendous amount of technique and information. So
Yeah.
it's like if you want to get 20 feet in the air, but you're already 15 feet up on a step ladder, you don't have to reach that much further, but you still have to have the intuition and judgment of the astrologer. Without that, it does not work. It does not work by itself. It will not work through a computer. It's not going to work through AI, at least for a while. I think AI is garbage. I mean, every time I read all this stuff about how great it is, and then I look at my interaction with it, it's idiotic. It's useless. It's like totally overblown. My wife got thrown off Amazon. She used to do reviews, right? And every time she bought something, she'd review it and she'd do a quick review because she wanted to, do all their stuff. They threw her off. Like, oh, you're fake. She appeals it to the Philippines or something to some, poor person who's like slave labor person
Because
for
she does it too
Amazon.
often.
Whatever. It hit her algorithm.
Yeah.
So it's good job. Same thing with Facebook. They keep throwing my ads off for talismans because they claim it's dealing with social and political issues. I'm like, what social and political issue in my ad for Sun Aries talisman? What?
Yeah,
It's just,
I've heard
and I can't appeal it either. There's nothing to do about it. It's just, so I'm like, great algorithm, great AI. I'm really impressed, so it's just like that or the Matrix. I'm like, yeah, didn't you see the Matrix? Why do you want to do AI? You know, it just seems like a really kind of crazed thing. But anyhow, what I would say about it is that so far, like for example, people try to do these electional software and they can't do it. Can't do it. And that's relatively simple. I mean, choosing an election only requires you to do certain factors, but prediction, like a horary, no way. There's no way the computer's going to be able to do that. You're not going to
yeah.
be able to encode it properly. You're not an oracle. Now, it gets to a point where they have intelligence. Yeah, because the computer is intelligent. I don't think that they're not intelligent. They have a weird intelligence. It's kind of funky. It's not a human intelligence, but they're intelligent. There's no question they're highly intelligent in a kind of weird ass way. But because I don't think it's just because it's immaterial or created by humans, it doesn't mean it's intelligent or alive. And computers are alive too. Of course they are. Why would they
Yeah.
not be alive?
I think it
Internet
get
is very alive. It's pretty
yeah.
crazy.
It is. It very
Yeah,
much is.
and not in a good way either. I mean, I would have to say, I don't know. I have to really kind of, the jury's out as far as I'm concerned. It's like it's certainly no more than 50-50 good evil, the internet. There's a lot, so much evil stuff. And it allows people to get together that they're spiritual, but it allows a whole lot of people to get together that are insane, crazy, messed up, you know, just horrible stuff. It's like a
Yeah.
reactor. In a reactor, what you've got is um, you've got these rods of uranium 235, right? And so they're in graphite, which blocks the radiation. And so what you do is when you start the radiator up, you pull the rods out of the graphite and they start interacting with each other, and that starts all this radiation starts getting really hot and everything like that. And if you don't control that, you get a meltdown. So that's what we're doing. We're pulling them out. By concentrating all that stuff, a lot. It's like everyone's individual craziness. Then they can get in touch with 1,000 other crazy people just like them, and they goad each other on. So it's
Totally.
like really not it's so funny because you look at how naive they were, when they started, like, this is going to be great, and it'll be great, and everyone will get to say what they want and everything. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people have a lot of bullshit to say too. We have to listen to that. So like I said, internet has been great for me. I couldn't have done what I
Me
did
too.
without it in all my career stuff. I mean, as a lawyer, I have incredible access to all these legal databases. I can just use, right? You don't have to go to, when I went to law school, you had to go to the library and you'd pull the book out and look up in the index and you'd pull the thing, look up in the cases and write it down and stuff. This is like really laborious. Whereas now I can just do a Boolean search of this huge, every single case in the United States, and it'll pop up all the things. I can look at it really easily, cut and paste. Makes it really simple. And or internet, like with my whole astrology, like before the internet, you had to go to conferences. And if you weren't in with the conference crowd, they just freeze you out. It was in group and out group, just like it is now. You couldn't do anything.
Speaking of
You
that,
know,
are you at NORWAC this year?
they asked me, but I couldn't go because last year I got COVID and it's
I
just so
know, yeah.
exhausting. The travel is just like kills
The
me. I don't
travel.
like to travel. And I think that I really wish that they would do more stuff on Zoom, you know? I mean, it's easy for me because I don't like to travel to say it's better for the planet, but that is an advantage of not having this stuff. It's just like, I mean, the amount of carbon, that could produces for people to get together is just out of control. And
People like to commune in the
it's cool.
physical.
It's great. It really is awesome. I understand why they do it. For me, I can read a novel in like a day. I could read 200 pages in a day easily, no problem. So to sit and look, the amount of information I could get by reading in an hour, people send me video, watch this video. I'm like, no way. Whereas they send me the written stuff, I can zip
Place
through it.
through it.
Yeah. So it just seems like it's like my courses are the same way. It's like because people like they sign up, they go, when do I get the lectures? I'm like, I don't do lectures. How's that possible? And I'm like, you just read, you know? And it's like it's an old style. It's funny because I've got this guy who wants me to do. He's got some setup with some university in the Caribbean that's got, it's like accredited in some, I don't know, like some Caribbean country, and he does like acupuncture or something, which kind of makes it like Caribbean medical school. You know about that?
Hmm.
You
I
you know
think
if you can't
so.
get into medical school in the United States, you go to medical school in the Caribbean, and you got to take the test, and it's hard, right? But there are people that are able to do that. So I think that's kind of the model. And for acupuncture, it kind of makes sense because you got to learn a lot for acupuncture. I mean, that's a
Mhm.
really rigorous thing.
It really
He
is.
wanted to do astrology, like degrees in astrology, and I was just sort of like, I'm going to talk to him, but I'm just sort of like, that's a weird model, you know? It's like because I went to college in University of St Andrews in Scotland, and they still kind of had the idea when I went there that if you're going to study history, you're going to be a historian. So it's like on the job training for historians. And so we did like history stuff. Like had the tutorial system where you get together with your tutor with a couple other students and you read essays. That's the main focus of the education. And you could go to lectures or not. You don't have to go to lectures if you don't feel like it. And then we did like lectures to each other. We really hung out with the professors. I mean, he basically taught you how to be a professor, right? It's on the job training. But that's become the model for everything. So if you want to know how to do like maintain the grass in a stadium, you got to do a PhD in turfology and sit in a class. I'm like, that's ridiculous. Like learn, I mean, with lawyers, to learn a law, you used to just apprentice. You'd hang out with the lawyer and be his clerk or whatever and learn that way. It's like a much superior method for most things is to learn by doing it. But I mean, and that's what the academics do. They're learning by doing. I mean, all the stuff we do is actually on the job academic training for academics because that's what
Hmm.
you actually do. It's on
Hmm.
the job training. But it's become this whole thing of like, and so expensive, insanely expensive, $100,000 or whatever, and you learn nothing of any use, you know? And it's just ridiculous. I mean, the whole educational system is so gross and disgusting and like and exploitative and wasteful and everything like that. It's like, I mean, for example, I'm in Iowa. They have the Iowa Writers Workshop. You ever heard of that?
I don't think so, even though I'm
Iowa
close.
Writers Workshop is like, well, it was funny because it's very famous, and it's like you get an MFA after you do it. But anyhow, I was reading about it, and they said we're like Juilliard, and I'm like, oh yeah, because you know about Juilliard, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Juilliard is their approach is super, super technical at the same time as being creative. But they insist that people have to have this really solid grounding in the classical approach, as well as being great artists. And
Hmm.
and they do both, right? So it's super intensive, but it's very much like I said, intense on the job training for it. The same thing with Writers Workshop. They have tons of like you have to constantly be writing, and then you get feedback both from the other students and from your teachers. And they want you to be how do you act as a professional writer? They teach you how to be a professional writer. That's what it's all on the job training. I'm like, that stuff will continue. But like, you know, oh, I've got a BS in communications, and I got drunk for 4 years or whatever, and I got
Yeah.
$100,000 in debt. It's like that's all useless. It's
There
like it's
is
all
a,
just a complete waste. And the social prestige, like they won't hire you because you don't have the stuff. It's like, I mean, I got the benefit of it. I mean, I've got as long as I was an astrologer, I mean, I wasn't practicing much as an attorney, but I kept my bar membership up and say, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm an attorney. And people are like, ooh. Whereas if I said I was an astrologer, people would be so like, "Ugh." I mean, I have to be very careful about who I say that to, because a lot of people, some people think I'm an astronomer. It's like, oh, you at the university? It's like, no. But the astrologer doesn't
yeah,
have the same. It's kind of out there, and it's funny with
does not
lawyers
have
too.
prestige.
No, it's funny with lawyers too, because I'll mention the stuff, and they'll just be like, the main thing that the conventional reality is it kind of dumbfounds them. They don't know what to say. It's like that's when I say I'm an astrologer, then it'd be just like because they're like, you seem like a serious person.
They
You're
don't
not
because
like some
they
kind of like blue-haired, con artist, gypsy fortune teller kind of person. That's
like a
basically what they
snake
think
oil.
of. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so um, it's still a crime in New York to be an astrologer. What's really the crime is to say it's real.
Yeah, that's
To
right. That's
pretend
why I
to be
was
an
thinking
astrologer. See, if you say it's fake, that's why they entertainment purposes only stuff, which I refuse to do that. I'm like, that offends me greatly that I would have to do that. It's like you can do it as long as you say it's fake. I'm like, this is not fake. It's like, and it's not that I believe in it. She said, do you believe in that? And I said, do you believe in atoms? They're like, no. I'm like, they're real. I'm like, there you go. I said, astrology is real. It's like in my worldview, it makes perfect sense. It's not a belief. That's what I'm saying. A belief is like believing in God is just like believing in Santa Claus. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. You're allowed to do it, right? But it's absolutely ridiculous. It says the same level of plausibility in the atheistic materialism because there's no Santa Claus anymore. There's no God, you know?
we're back at worldview.
Yeah, right. But that's everything. That's what someone's saying. Oh, you're so boring. Why don't you keep talking about worldview? I'm like, what else is there? If you don't resolve that foundation, it's the man who builds his house upon the sand, right? It's the wise man builds his house upon the rock, and you're not building upon a rock unless you have that firm foundation of knowing what your worldview is. Because there's nothing wrong with atheistic materialism as a worldview, but there's only a few like people that are atheist. They get mad at everybody else. Like everybody knows there's no God, and yet you keep saying there is. It's like they're right. They're the only ones who are internally consistent, right? But that's a very small percentage of the population. Like, how many times, like Mutual of Omaha, when I was a kid, they'd be going, we had to kill a bunch of these caribou to save them.
Oh,
It was
don't
the
get me
whole
started
thing.
on
You
that.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's the
Yeah.
whole thing. I was like, come on. That's what's crazy about it is the modern religions are totally permeated by atheist materialism, and they only do it because you're supposed to. I mean, they believe in God because you're supposed to believe in God, but everyone knows. I mean, I remember my parents. I asked them that. They're like, why do you go to church? I said, do you pray to God? And they're just like, that was so ridiculous. I'm like, where I pray every day. I constantly pray,
Yeah.
you
And you
know?
were talking about that earlier where you were like, I think you were saying petitioning God, and in some of the more like Bacchic prayers or like Sufic like prayers. You get prayers that it's not only just making a relationship and like glorifying that like essence in your life or the occult virtue that's come into your life because you've had the, relationship with the god or the planet, but it's also like you do hear these like songs and these poems like crying out, right, to the deity and saying
There's a
like,
lot of different ways you can do it. It's perfectly
yeah,
okay to ask for stuff. I mean, I remember this Ibn Arabi saying, that like when you ask, there's some things you need to ask for to get. And if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. And
yeah,
so, I mean, if you're asking for like, because I'm praying a lot for, for my wife and everyone to be healthy and happy and that sort of stuff, and it's like, if it's just like, well, I mean, maybe you won't, will, or maybe you won't, but I'm just going to ask anyway. At the same time, there's a lot of different, like I said, the Sufi stuff is all the love and, the kind of longing for the one and everything like that, and that's cool too. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of different ways of, then and there's a hadith, which is a verified saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that says there's many paths as there are human souls. And so that's again back to that. This is like you just have to find, but I think it's safer to find one that's right hand path. I think it's safer to always be trying to help people rather than trying to hurt people. I think it's safer to try to do the best you can.
mhm.
Um, yeah, she's very high functioning autistic, and
Yes,
she's written a lot of
yes.
books. But what she did for her career was she loved animals, so she designed slaughterhouses because she really understood how so rather than having them suffer, right? She made it for as least suffering as possible. So that's kind of what I feel like my function is in the whole eviction stuff, is to do this in the most fair and just way with the least suffering as possible. And if I didn't, it would be just landlords doing it all and it would be worse. Not to say that I particularly like the system the way it is. That's the thing about law, is that the law is really a duality of strict justice and mercy, right? So mercy, if you have total mercy, then the innocent suffer because there's no punishment, there's no stopping the evil, right? And nothing's ever done appropriately. It's law of the jungle, really, because everyone just gets away with it. At the same time, strict justice, if you have, it's like if who would escape whipping, if we all got our just desserts, an eye for an eye, we'll all be blind. Martin
Mhm,
Luther King says that. So that's that blending of those two. That's how the judge, a true judge, that's what you have to come up with. That's in the individual circumstance to do justice is to both take into consideration strict justice and mercy and to
mhm,
produce the appropriate result. And that's a heavy, heavy responsibility. I mean, this
mhm,
is what my focus has been. I'm kind of trying to, I'm not a judge, but that's kind of my approach. It probably undermines my ability to be the advocate, but I try for when I'm in court and when I'm doing everything is to try to have a fair, objectively fair for everybody. And
mhm.
and that has a spiritual quality to it as well.
Yeah,
That's what I've been
absolutely
called
does.
upon to do that. And so I that's what I think about is like there is just when you think you got it, there's always another layer to go.
Yeah,
There's
so that
always
should be
more.
hopeful actually for people is that there's nowhere to go and there's these layers, and as soon as you get to a layer, you have another one to go. So that's actually an opportunity. So it kind of says
You
like,
want to do it. It's like I said, is like like I said, the recognition is that everything's perfect the way it is, ultimately. I mean, there's all horrible stuff. I mean, there's no question there's all sorts of horrible stuff, but ultimately everything's perfect. So it's fine. It's fine. You know, it's like, and that's like funny because if I get freaked out, what I've been doing recently is be like, I accept this. It's like that
mhm,
works really well.
mhm.
That's probably my thing is I'm trying to wake up. I used to be able to do lucid dreaming and I haven't been. My dream state tends to show my waking state, what level of awareness I'm at. And I'm just not at all lucid at all in my dreams. And if that just shows in my waking life, I'm not lucid either. I'm just like, bummer. Because it's like I'm getting close. And
Oh Lord,
at the moment of death, right? You have this experience of the Dharma Dhatu, and it's like I'm probably I'm gonna be reincarnated. I'm like, darn, I'm just not advanced enough in my practice to be able to like I probably have more stuff to do anyway. But whatever. I mean, I've done I tried to do the best I could, you know, in this life, and it's like, but I'm 60, so it's like, yeah, you know what I did yesterday was, or actually on Friday was I went and bought a grave plot because I have the cemetery I walk in, and I always walk in it, and I just was like, I've been thinking, yeah, I should do that. And so I did. And I was thinking about it. So I'm going to put up our gravestone. And I was thinking that'd be a great meditation. Every day, go on the grave, go see my gravestone.
I
It's
love
got my
that.
name on it.
I
So
actually
it's
love
like,
that.
so it's funny because I was talking to the supervisor of the cemetery because it's a city cemetery, and he's like saying, he said, oh yeah, this a columbarium is where you put cremated remains. It's like a kind of like looks like a big cube, like big granite cube. And he said, oh, this couple, they bought one for two people. And so the husband died. And so the wife was just going to have her put her name on it. And he said the kids freaked out. They said, it's too weird. Don't put it on there. I'm like, really what they were just like, if don't think about death, don't think
Hmm.
about it, just avoid it. And that's where our society is. I mean, when I go to the cemetery, people are always putting like birthday stuff, like balloons and stuff. And I'm like, that's okay, but it's not really like I've seen people down their grave, they have an Amway symbol or the Hawkeyes, Iowa Hawkeyes, the football team. And I'm just like, I mean, that's okay if you love it and everything, but it's still a little bit like happy, 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 happy. And you're like talking about this is a gravestone that there's a freaking corpse underneath. It's like, is that really? I don't know. I'm Saturn. Like I said, this is like why I like the cemetery too, because it's very Saturnine. But the other thing about the cemetery that's nice is that it's beautiful because it's life and death. It's a beautiful cemetery. It's like beautiful trees and flowers and grass. It's so gorgeous. So it's life and death. Now, if
I
it was
love
all
it.
dead, if it was all dead, it was like, like barren. It would be too much death, you know? It wouldn't be balanced. But as it is, it was like it has a good balance. But I like it because, the neighborhood I live in is really old. It's like it dates back to 1856, and the cemetery dates back to 1843. It's almost 200 years old, which for Iowa is just like prehistoric.
Hmm.
So I like that. It's like anything traditional, I'm a big fan of. That's my whole Saturn thing as well. It's like I love being like it's like the law. Oh, I love the law. Has such deep old roots. And it's so much tradition and it's alive too. That's what I love about the legal stuff is that it's very organic and holistic. The common law system is very flexible and organic and holistic, but it's also deeply rooted in the traditions of the English speaking peoples. So it's like it trips me out. At the same time, you get fucked over all the time too. There's all sorts of injustice and stuff going on, but it's just like it's a trip. Like I said, this is like if you can just be aware of where you are, and it's also nice to avoid the plastic reality. People used to have folk songs that were passed down from generation. Now you're getting everything off with this like Disney, right? It's all this synthesized plastic mythology for people, you know? People love Disney. People are just nuts about Disney. People make pilgrimages to Disney World, but it's like it's all corporate, man. It's all controlled. It's like I like to be
Disney's the new
free.
folk narrative.
It is. An author named Jan Kulianu. He wrote a book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And he was a professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And it was all about magic, really. And he talks about psychological magic, what I call mass magic or like advertising marketing, which are all types of magic. And it's incredibly practiced today. And internet and movies and TV and stuff allow you to do incredibly powerful versions of it. And that's what Giordano Bruno was what he was using, talks about images and sounds, but they didn't have the technical ability to do what we can do now. Because so Culiano, he differentiated between what he called the this like a secret police state, like a totalitarian, with secret police and and then we called a sorcerer state. And the sorcerer state is the capitalist ones with the consumer capitalism, and the advertising and all this kind of marketing and stuff like that. And they control you. It's more subtle, but it's still a means of control. And so that's how, that we're dealing with incredible master mages now. People are just completely in the thrall of the people who are able to
It's
now,
not so subtle.
except the flip side of it is that the master mage in that situation is just controlled by the masses as the masses are controlled by them. You know, it's not this whole idea of some passive sheep that are controlled because you can't put out there what they're not responsive to.
Hmm.
See? So they're just as controlled
Yeah.
themselves. And so once you become a celebrity or someone like that, you are controlled, you're in the thrall, you're like, it sucks. I mean, being famous is a disaster. It's not something that
I
I would
would
wish on
not. I would not
anybody.
like
I
it.
mean, it would just be again because I'm a Saturnine person. I'm like a cat. They don't know people looking at them.
The celebrities talk about that all the time, though, like how terrible it is and how
It's
they don't.
horrific.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
mean, it's like I have I have rule of the 10th, Jupiter, well dignified in Pisces in the first. So that's an indication of fame, but I'm famous in a low level way. I mean, among astrological magicians, they've heard of me, right? Among attorneys who do land lieutenant law in Iowa, they've heard of me. You know what I mean? That's the kind of that's what I like to be. My desire to be well respected by my peers. That's kind of thing. Or like I'm, known in my hometown. That's enough. But
To be
other than
respected
that,
by our peers is a big deal.
well, I'm a little bit ego based on that because obviously have a lack of self-esteem, so I try to compensate for that by with that. But it's like it'd be nice to be able to not care about that sort of thing. But I obviously don't care enough about it that I'm not totally conventional, you know.
Yeah, but I would say like, probably we all have, our own versions of lack of self-esteem or wanting some kind of aggrandizement. But I think that there's more to it, like, because if you're putting so much of yourself out there in things like magic and stuff, it's just like whether or not someone practices, the Warnock style of worldview and magic, it is nice to know that like, hey, my first like astrological magic book was Christopher Warnock's. Like it's nice to know that like the work that you put out is being received, even if it's not being, stamped as like this is how I do it. Like it's the influence. It's still, I think
Yeah.
it's important to know that we're
I, I,
influenced
I
by the
like to
people in
have
our
the
community.
idea of I like the idea of that I'm having this influence on how people think because
Yeah.
that's the deepest thing. That's the thing about I'm writing this book is like this legal book is that, it's not a book of rules. It's basically a book of, like I said, this has the conceptual tools that you need to solve any problem that comes in front of you.
Hmm.
Any problem that arises, you can use this. So it's not like you look it up the book and find out what the rule is. It's like you understand the underlying principles. And once you understand the underlying principles and you unite that with your sense of justice, right? And then a practical individual circumstance of facts, then you can resolve it in a fair and equitable way. So
I
it's really
think
almost
that's
for judges. Um, it's interesting. We use the heuristic every day, right, to get through the day. And so as soon as you hear the word, the particular relationship pops into your head and you assume that's what's going on. Like when I'm trying to have like a book, like I used to have a lot of books, intellectual. All these books I got to move. What am I going to do? And freaking out of my books. And sometimes I'll say, I don't need this. And it's right, I am a poor wayfaring stranger traveling through this world alone. That's what we are,
we
you
are.
know? This is
Hmm.
like you don't need this shit.
We don't need
Like because
any of it.
you don't need anything. You don't even need you. There's no you.
Hmm.
If there's no you, how can you need anything? I mean, blah 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 blah. But it's sort of like that attachment stuff is like now I have a certain attachment to stuff like I need to be like we'll have to I'm already thinking about okay, we're gonna move into a condo, then we move into assisted living kind of thing. I mean, that's another weird thing because I have these old people like, oh, we're gonna age in place. I'm like, yeah, right, until you trip and fall down the stairs, and then you got to
Yeah,
move
it
to
lasts for
assisted
so
living in five
long.
minutes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
rather plan into it. I'm like, I know I'm gonna end up there, so I might as well just fucking get it planned out. So the same thing with a gravestone. That's the ultimate one. Like, where do you think you're going to end up? When you're 60, you're like, that shit. I mean, you can't really I mean, when you're 20, you can deny, you cannot think about it. But when you're 60, you're like really fucking inescapable, you
Hmm.
know? So that's what I'd say is like, that's all useful stuff. Like I said, it's less painful to give it up early than it is to give it up later, you know? And that's why you reincarnate anyway, because you can't stand to give it up. It's like,
Hmm.
if you have that really strong attachments, then it's like, you're gonna reincarnate for sure, you know? So like I said, I don't know. I mean, I keep thinking sometimes I like think I've done really well, and other times I don't think I've done really well. It's like I'm saying, oh, I'm doing great. I mean, I like having a legacy. I think that's cool. That's what I get for not having a family. I had no family, no kids, none of that stuff. So I get to have I get to write a book. I mean, a lot of people would think that was not a good deal, you know?
Yeah, I guess it
Just
depends
depends on
on
the
your
person.
proclivities. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
exactly.
for a Saturn Aquarius person, it is,
And
to have
I
this
think,
wide societal, to have a massive influence on the law for me is like, oh, it trips me out. I love it. There's cases see, that's the thing about doing appellate law is that when you do a case, that case then becomes law. So I have, for example, in Washington, D.C., where I practice, I have cases that still, that's the main case on that area. Like, for example, the right to jury trial, right, is one of my cases, is a key case in the right to jury trial, you know? And so, like, I talked to a friend of mine who practices there. He's like, "Oh yeah, that's what they use." So it's like that's cool because
That is
it's like building a cathedral. Like I did one little piece, like I engraved this little piece of the cathedral. You know what I mean? The cathedral's already there, right? But I did this. I'm responsible for this little piece of it, and it'll go on after
I
me.
think that's the cool thing about lineage, or what we were talking
Yeah,
about with like lineage and respect and like all of this stuff, where it's like it's it's not about like the hierarchy of respect. It's more of like you did this piece in this chain, and it's like a beautiful thing to sort of like gift, but then you also want the community from it. So it's like, okay, yeah, I wrote the book, but it's also nice to see the reflection back from the people whom the book has influenced in a positive
that's the
way.
most
Like,
important thing, though. See,
yeah,
because
exactly.
the book is just this like material manifestation of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the
It's
book is
like
like not the thing until you're like involved with the community in that way, and you're involved in the passing and the, back and forth flow of that lineage,
what's
which
what's really cool about my book on the legal stuff is that you know um, that to see the underlying patterning, it's almost archaeological. Weird. So my life is full of weird stuff like that. I mean, a lot of weird synchronicities that I don't know what they mean, but that shows me again, that's the worldview stuff, is that everything is patterned, everything happens for a purpose, everything's meaningful. At the same time, there's a lot of flex too. That's
yeah.
what's weird. My wife is into near-death experiences.
Oh, that's
Like you die and you go through the tunnel and stuff like that. And what's funny about them is so many of these near-death experiences, when they show up through the light, for the light beings or angels or God or whatever, they go, "Oops, you're not supposed to be here."
yeah, I've had that.
That stuff happens all the time. So
Yeah.
it shows you it's not like even in the celestial hierarchies and stuff, they make mistakes and it's all messed, it's like not perfect. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like this idea of fate and free will, like, oh, there's complete choice to do everything, or it's totally written in stone perfectly, right? It's like neither of them seems to accurately reflect the reality. So it's like they use that whole celestial bureaucracy kind of thing. They're like, you're not supposed to be here. They look in the book and they're like, wait a second, you're not here. You got to go back. It happens all
Yeah,
the time. It's like, which is funny, isn't it? That
it is.
that's, like the angels don't have their shit together totally. I mean, they mostly have it. At least could figure it out eventually. You know what I mean?
Folk stories and stuff, though, they have that kind of like built in of the gods being like not quite perfect, or like oopses happen or whatever
Well, the
there too.
intermediate ones aren't perfect,
Yeah, for sure.
But even though it's funny how people think it's a very Protestant. They think I talk to God. I'm like the ultimate power of the universe, really. It's like, no, you talk to an intermediary. You
Yeah.
talk to a manifestation of it, a limited manifestation of that. I mean, everything is a manifestation of the one. So it's like it's not we're talking to God all the time.
So, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and with us again. Next time, if there's a next time, I hope there is, maybe we can delve a little bit more into that fate and free will that you glossed upon here at the end. I think that would make for good conversation and learning possibilities.
Sure. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
Thank you so much again, Christopher, for
Yeah,
being here.
thank you.
And I just want to point people back to The Celestial Way, which is amazing, or any of Christopher's books. I'll put some talks and like links below to your shop, talisman,
Cool.
books, things like
Yeah,
that,
books
of
and
course.
yeah, talismans. Cool.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for tuning in. And of course, thank you to the great mage, philosopher, astrologer, Christopher Warnock. All right. Until next time. Ciao.
Matai matau kakau bersama yo kena soba da soba kena matai banakau di mawa kena soba and soba atai banake ujuna ba ikana kamaya da onga ija